Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for taking the time to connect with us. A warm welcome to this, the first of our live broadcast events, in which we'll be looking at the changing consumer in this post-Brexit, COVID-era world, and considering how the changing behaviours and priorities of the changing consumer should change the way businesses engage with their consumer audience. My name's Alex Newman. I'm your chairperson for today's discussion. I'm a lawyer at Irwin Mitchell, and I spend most of my time advising businesses about intellectual property issues, helping them to identify and exploit IP-related opportunities, mitigate IP-related risks, and resolve IP-related disputes. More importantly, I'm delighted to be joined today by Sarah Webster from Britvic and Rachel Bauer from the PR agency Engine MHP. Now, Britvic as a business probably needs a little introduction. A British institution with global reach and home to some of Britain's best loved soft drinks brands, including Robinson's, Bar Whites, J2O, Tango, and of course Britvic. Now, in 2019, Britvic evolved its strategy to align with the changing consumer and retail landscape, recognising the need for diversity as a key to growth, that no market and no consumer are the same, and that localised solutions created by a diverse workforce are essential for giving consumers what they want. Sarah Webster is Britvic's Director of Sustainable Business. Sarah is responsible at Britvic plc for setting the sustainable business framework, Healthier People, Healthier Planet. This includes setting global minimum standards of execution, governance oversight, and communicating and engaging with internal and external stakeholders to generate a transparent understanding of Britvic plc's progress and challenges. With over 20 years of FMCG experience, including 18 years with Diageo, Sarah's cross-functional career spans sustainable business, investor relations, finance, M&A, marketing and innovation. Engine MHP is a PR and communications firm based in London, established in 2010 and now with a large team of over 200. Engine MHP helps its clients to navigate the often volatile landscape it calls the networked age. Its specialisms include brand strategy, influencer strategy, corporate reputation, consumer marketing and crisis management. Rachel Bauer is head of the brand and reputation practice at Engine MHP. She's responsible for leading a team of consultants working for many of the world's leading organisations. The team's work ranges from reputation strategy development and campaign building to strategic media advisory services and press office support. It specialises in working for organisations that operate in the full glare of the public spotlight. Rachel has over 20 years of experience with helping internationally recognised brands with their PR, brand strategy and crisis. Sarah and Rachel, thank you very much for joining us. Now, in particular, we're going to be focusing today on the importance of corporate social responsibility and general all-round fair play in a social media world. And why is this important? Well, these are some of the biggest issues grabbing consumer attention on social media these days. One false move can create a Twitter meltdown and some regrettable and enduring hashtags. Whilst not all consumers will fire up a tweet or post to let their thoughts be known, you can be sure that every consumer with a smartphone is being bombarded with content, comments and opinion every time a consumer business behaves in a way which is deemed newsworthy. So we'll be looking at what consumer businesses are currently doing, what they should be doing to minimise the prospects of the wrong kind of social media storm. And that's something every business wants to avoid, even those with a reputation for causing controversy and those with heavy social media engagement. So before we kick off and hear from Sarah and Rachel, just a couple of housekeeping issues that I need to cover. Firstly, the chat function in Teams is available if anybody wants to make a comment. We're not planning on doing a Q&A session today. But if you do have any questions or want to ask any, please do use the chat function and leave your name and contact details so that we can come back to you later if we don't get to your question during the session. Secondly, we will be recording this virtual event and this will be sent out afterwards to anyone who's registered for the event. Finally, towards the end of the session, we will be posting the feedback link. So please take a couple of minutes to let us know your feedback. It is invaluable to us in helping us make sure that our future events are relevant and of interest. And finally, whilst we're booked in for an hour today in this session, we may well not take the full hour. We'll talk through the issues we've got to talk about. And if we get done early and are able to release you all to go about your business and get on with the day and enjoy the sunshine, then we'll be very happy to do that. So anyway, enough from me. Let's hear from Sarah and Rachel. The first issue we're going to talk about is corporate social responsibility, and I'll set the context. So Sarah, Rachel, The accepted wisdom is that sustainability, localism, employee welfare, and all-round good ethical conduct have become much more important to consumers and key to building consumer trust and loyalty. Get it right, social media will love you. Get it wrong, you risk becoming a social media pariah whose fortunes will reflect that. First question I want to ask, and I suspect it's the question which many consumers ask themselves, is what are the motivations for businesses' sustainability and ethical sourcing policies? And how much of an influence is the anticipated reporting and consumer reaction to those policies when it comes to devising them, budgeting for them, implementing them, and talking publicly about them? Sarah, if I can, I'll come to you first in relation to that.
Thank you, Alex, and good morning, everybody. The first thing I'd like to say is that the business case has never been stronger. You talked about employees. Employees want to work for companies that do the right thing. Our customers are demanding that we make the right choices, particularly in soft drinks around packaging and HFSS, which is high fat, salt, sugar products. And of course, carbon reduction. You know, the British Retail Consortium, which represents a large number of our customers, have committed to net zero by 2040. Governments expect businesses to do the right thing, and if they don't, then they will regulate. In fact, actually, that can be quite helpful, particularly when you think about the deposit return scheme and the incredible transformational impact that will have on collecting all of those plastic bottles, which we're often in the news for, because it creates that solution and it creates a fair framework for that. And equally, it is an area of potential competitive advantage, and I think that should not be lost. And to get back to the specifics of your questions, the consumers demand that we make the right choices. They want us to help them make the right choices, whether it's via social media or not. We are a consumer-driven business, and we are driven by consumer insight. The final point with regard to stakeholders as well is investors, and this comes back to your point on reporting and engagement. Let's face it, I spent 10 years in investor relations. They were a little late to the party in the mainstream. However, I am delighted that in the last 2 years they have made up for that. It's changed markedly. They are demanding that boards and executive teams consider ESG factors, and they generally use these indices to track companies' performance. And just yesterday, talking to investors, that if you don't have the right level of transparency, the right level of engagement, you're not serious enough about your ESG. That's now a barrier to investment, and that certainly focuses the mind of executive teams of businesses, around the country and indeed globally. So as a business, it's really important that we understand our material issues. And I'll probably come back to this a few times, and be clear for what we stand for, and how, particularly in Britvic's case, how are we going to create a better tomorrow through a people, planet and performance lens, because you can't disaggregate them anymore. They are all joined up, and that is really fundamental, and that is the focus of our communications to all our stakeholders, whoever they may be.
Thank you, Sarah. I mean, it certainly sounds like there are a whole host of aspects that are brought to bear on the planning, the devising of those policies. Rachel, does what Sarah's said sort of resonated with you? Do you share those views? Do you have a different take?
No, I'm in total agreement. I think it's really interesting, a couple of the points that Sarah is making, one around the role of investors driving the agenda now. I think that is so true, and I think that's one of the biggest changes that we've seen in the last few years. I think companies are rightly concerned about activist investors. There's a worry that if you're not doing the right thing and you're not demonstrating that transparency and you're not looking beyond the bottom line for your contribution to society, that there is a real fear that if you became the target for an activist investor, then you are going to have to make some serious changes as a business. So I think that I'm in total agreement with the investor piece. I think one of the changes came a number of years ago, sort of more broadly, when the global roundtable for all of the chief executives in the US started. I think it was back in the beginning of 2019, where they talked about now the need for all businesses to drive towards stakeholder capitalism rather than shareholder focus. And I think that, exactly as Sarah has said, has been one of the key drivers for why we are seeing a more transparent approach to business practices and the way that businesses are operating. And I think that's everything, again, as Sarah's saying, from whether that's the way that you treat your employees, as well as the way that you market your products, as well as looking at other issues around supply chain governance and provenance and things like that. So I think that's definitely the case. I think one of the points you made at the beginning in your introduction, Alex, you talked also about this series that you're doing and sort of looking at post-pandemic, kind of in a new COVID landscape. And I think actually, on a very practical level in the UK, actually, this focus that we've been talking about more broadly has almost come to the fore, whether that is businesses needing to demonstrate their contribution to kind of local communities in the UK. I think in some ways this sort of theory has felt a little bit more tangible in the last 18 months, whether that's, supermarkets who've been prioritising key workers, or whether it's been hotels using unoccupied parts of their portfolio to support homeless people, or whether it's been other consumer related businesses sort of pivoting on what their core product is to then support. I think we've seen it sort of exacerbated probably in the last 18 months, and in many ways that's been great to see and be part of being able to promote some of those things.
Thank you. So I guess one of the follow-up questions, and listening to both of you respond on that, it's the question that comes into my mind is, to what extent and how big an influence is actually the pure sort of, I guess, altruistic, it's purely the right thing to do to adopt these policies and ensure that a business does the right thing when it comes to its sourcing policies, its environmental policies, its treatment of its workers. How much is the motivation for these policies purely that it's the right thing to do, as opposed to it's something that is required for to keep investors happy, to keep customers happy, to keep the public glare shining in the right way on a business? Sarah, I'll come to you first on that if I can.
Well, given my role, I say it's first and foremost, to be perfectly honest. I mean, we are commercial enterprises, so we do have to make money. But I think certainly, in my experience in FMCG over the last 20 plus years, is that it comes down to the values of organisations, and it's embedded in the culture and the values. So yes, of course there are, those other stakeholder drivers, but fundamentally it's the right thing to do. Now, sometimes we might not be able to act as fast as we can in particular areas, that we might be missing some things, and we have to prioritise. So that's why it comes back again to knowing your material issues. But fundamentally, it's the right thing to do. It's, we want people to enjoy coming to work for Britvic. Part of that is, their purpose, sharing part of their purpose with Britvic's purpose, and that's why they rock up, and that's how you're going to get the best out of people, because fundamentally people are motivated, and you'll probably know far more about this than me, Rachel, motivated by the purpose rather than just the sort of financial outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of our clients have been discussing recently the whole concept of being a B Corp and what does that mean and what does that deliver for your business. And I was looking in preparation for this at some of their research, and some of their research say that almost 3/4 of consumers believe that businesses must act beyond their bottom line. They must be demonstrating how they are making efforts to protect the natural environment, or looking again at what the companies are doing in order to demonstrate their kind of social value and their purpose, as you say. So I think you're absolutely right in that it's the right thing to do. And as you say, consumers are not naive. They also know that we're there, business is there to make money. I think now that there's just more of a focus on, as you say, what is a business's purpose beyond that profit? What are they doing to support people? What are they doing to support the planet? And so I think that's backed up with the evidence of kind of purpose-led brands and what they're seeing, contributing to their bottom line as well.
Thank you both. And one of your responses then, Rachel, actually preempted my next question, which is, I know from scrolling through my own sort of Instagram feed that I see posts from business leaders talking about environmental credentials, for example, and sometimes I'm a bit cynical about what the motivations are for it, and I wonder whether I'm alone. I doubt very much that I am. So I guess my next question is, are consumers becoming suspicious and cynical about businesses' eco credentials, and particularly the self-reporting of their environmental, social, and governance activity, and what the motivation for those policies are? So, Rachel, probably makes sense to come to you first in relation to that.
Yeah, a great question. I think the short answer is yes, but I think rightly so as well. So I don't necessarily think that customers and consumers are necessarily always concerned about the motivation that sits behind, as long as they are seeing real outcomes within the communication that businesses are putting out there. So I think people are increasingly suspicious, but I think that's one of the benefits, and one of the great things that's come out of social media has been this sort of a leveling playing field between different businesses and the opportunity to ask probing questions. I think where there is a level of cynicism, and I think we see this with consumers but also with the media, we were talking I think it was the week before last with Ben Spencer, who's the environmental editor at the Sunday Times, and he was saying what they are seeing is this drive towards ensuring that businesses are not just talking endlessly about commitments and long-term objectives, but they are actually talking about tangible outcomes and what they are doing and how that is affecting individuals' lives. So I think the cynicism sometimes comes in with targets, with long-term statements, which all need to be there, obviously, but I think that it's really important that, particularly in this current context, businesses are demonstrating what they are doing against those commitments. At MHP, we work with a team of behavioural science experts. You mentioned at the beginning the concept of the networked age, and very simply, that's just our approach to looking at how digital technology over the last couple of decades has sort of reshaped the way in which we communicate, how we engage with our communities, either through social or in person. And we often talk, when you talk about cynicism, about 3 drivers that clients need to be aware of when they're communicating more broadly about any topic. The first is that digital tech has made consumers more sceptical towards authority and expertise, so they are more likely to question. That doesn't mean that you don't say something, it just means that you just need to be aware that that is going to potentially be part of the response. And the second is that we've become as a society a little bit more activist in the way that we engage, whether that's liking a comment, whether that's signing an online petition, or whether that's actually campaigning in purpose. In practice, there's a sense of that we are all a little bit more activist. And then the hard thing, I think, in terms of how social media critique some of these things is that we are all a little bit more polarized. And so when Sarah and I have both mentioned purpose, I think one of the challenges is as we're all becoming increasingly polarized in our views and we're a little bit more tribal, one person's view of what a company should do that is good is not necessarily the same view that another individual holds about that company. So I think I hope that answers the question. I think we are more sceptical, but I think it's not anything to be afraid of. I just think it's a way in which one should consider the way in which you're communicating.
Great, thank you. And Sarah, I guess that same point. I mean, in your role, I guess the existence of consumerism and the potential for consumerism is an issue that you're aware of. And I guess my question to you is, what if anything do you do to factor in that that negative, I guess, in the consumer outlook, and what do you do to convince consumers that actually your credentials are genuine, they can believe in them, and you're doing things for the right reasons?
Yeah, and I think, you know, eco actives, as we call them, you know, are probably those who would apply the most scrutiny in my areas of sustainable business and ESG. And I think from a business perspective, you know, most businesses are trying to do the right thing. This area is moving incredibly quickly. We're all learning, and brands don't have all of the answers. So what's really important, and this is sort of a new management tool, I think, of this age, is some humility and appreciating and being open and transparent. Say, look, we haven't got all the answers, we're trying. And sometimes we're not going to get it right, but you've got to, you know, use that humility to demonstrate, you know, the positive intent of what you're trying to do. Equally, and I'll come on to sort of how we can avoid it or counter it. There are different views. If you take packaging, for example, lots of consumers, and I have it all the time when I see friends, you know, why don't you just put everything from plastic into a glass bottle? Because people see as glass is recyclable. What they don't know is that the carbon footprint of moving something round in a glass bottle is over twice as much as using a plastic bottle. It uses a lot more water. But of course, if we from Britvic say, well, actually glass is really bad for your footprint versus plastic, oh, you're just saying that because you've got loads of stuff in plastic. So it is, you know, that takes us on to some of the points that you can do, the fact behaviours and the communications you can put out there to sort of counter some of this. A lot of it is about data. It's really important, and having the evidence. And, you know, I think, I know the experts weren't particularly trusted, were they, Rachel, sort of going before the pandemic? But thanks to Professor Whitty and Patrick Vallance, you know, there's a bit more trust now in the experts. There's more trust in the science, and that is really important. So you've got to know the facts before we go out and make claims. I have, you know, conversations with some of the brand teams about that. You know, how do we know? You can't just put a statement out there and not back it up, because we know that the Accounting Standards Authority have gone after brands with very, very positive intent, talking about their carbon footprint on their label, but because it has been misleading, not necessarily incorrect, but misleading, they have been held up by the ASA. So, you know, again, it goes back to that positive intent, understanding, you know, where your halos are, and, you know, what are the good bits about your brand, which are the bits that actually you need to improve on, and keep it simple and stick to the facts. And again, you know, what are your material issues? So people could ask me about all sorts of social issues, but can Britvic make a material difference in all of those areas? No, we can't. We can make a material impact in areas such as packaging, sugar, water and carbon to an extent, because we've all got a carbon footprint, and talk about the progress. This goes back to Rachel's earlier point. Don't just put your targets out there, but talk about your progress and sometimes some of the challenges that you're facing. And that also adds to the credibility, of the humility side of things that I think businesses need to demonstrate.
Thank you, and that's absolutely clear. And yeah, I'm certainly less cynical than I otherwise might have been, having heard those answers. So thank you. I'll move on to the next topic for our conversation today, if I may, and this is really about, you know, how much the typical consumer really cares about a business's CSR credentials. So some businesses find themselves in use for all the wrong reasons in this context. We sometimes hear rumours of terrible working conditions and treatment of staff in factories abroad and at home in relation to some businesses, yet 6 months later we'll be reading in the news about their stellar trading performances. So, I mean, what does this sort of thing tell us about consumers' priorities when it comes to price and convenience on the one hand, and ethical sourcing and sustainability on the other? Sarah, if I can, I'll come to you first on that.
You raise a really good point, Alex, because there is a big difference between what people think and say and their actual behaviour. And yes, consumers do expect business to do the right thing, but equally they are, price and convenience is number one driver, and in soft drinks it's about taste and refreshment. So I think we are seeing a change. Those eco-active consumers are still in the minority, but that minority is growing. One thing that I think is important, price and convenience and doing the right thing aren't necessarily at opposite ends of the spectrum. What it does, it creates, an innovation opportunity for businesses to find the solution that meets both of those. Again, there's no doubt that shoppers and consumers' expectations are changing, whether that's the Blue Planet effect, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's the working conditions in our supply chain. I mean, we've seen the fashion industry under an awful lot of scrutiny, and they're expecting businesses to do the right thing. And even if consumers don't demand it yet across the board, our other stakeholders do. We've already talked about that. It's almost in some instances, consumers, or the mainstream consumer, is perhaps a little bit behind a lot of our other stakeholders. But we have to sort of help them with that, and help them, provide the solutions for them, so that they can, have the price, convenience, and it's been made, product has been made and branded and marketed in the right way.
Sure. Thank you, Sarah. Rachel, your views on that?
Yeah, I mean, again, total agreement, really. I think one of the areas that is really interesting, Sarah mentioned kind of the eco consumer and how sometimes behaviour lags behind belief. Which I think is very true. I think there's also a sense that one of the things that social media has done, it's made activism very easy, and you can be very vocal. You can vociferously object to something on social media by clicking, sharing content, liking, or being outraged. But behind the scenes, you are maybe not quite as an activist consumer as you think. I think it's probably similar to the shy Tory effect of polling and then the results at the end of the elections. I think it's very similar sort of concept. I think one of the things that is also interesting, I think, is also about, Sarah mentioned brand, and I think there is a different level of expectation actually to do with the sector or the type of brand that you are. So, for example, in the fashion industry, as Sarah mentioned, Patagonia sells itself on having a mission that it will not just do good, but it will ensure that it is advancing environmental policies. That's slightly different to some of the scrutiny that Boohoo faced with their supply chain, and the customer and the brands are actually quite different. And I think the expectations of brands, whether we like it or not, actually sometimes varies dependent on the brand itself. And I think we definitely see that sometimes with the type of behaviour that sometimes lags. And then I think the final point from my side would also just to play the long game a little bit. So it might not immediately, and I'm sure Sarah has seen this, it might not immediately, a big crisis might not immediately have an effect on your bottom line, but actually long term you almost get a sense of sort of like psychological a kind of impact over a longer term. So I think that's one thing to bear in mind as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I mean, your response that people publicly might take a particular stand in relation to a particular business's credentials, but then privately still carry on buying from them certainly resonates. I mean, I know for a fact that my recycling bin fills up with cardboard within a day of it being emptied, and I'm constantly feeling bad about that, but it hasn't yet stopped my sort of purchasing decisions and the way I approach things. So yeah, I guess consumers do have a long way to go. And as you've said, Sarah, I guess there are other stakeholders who are really carrying the baton and pushing the agenda more effectively in that respect than some consumers are. The next issue I wanted to really talk about was really the flip side of the issue we've just discussed, which is that some businesses we see are in the news regularly about doing the right kind of thing for the right reasons, being very vocal about what they do. So I can think of a very well-known brewer, for example, whose CEO is very active on social media, talking about carbon neutrality, planting a tree for every box of beer that's sold. Yet then very recently that same brewer has been in the news for all the wrong reasons about culture internally, impact on the well-being of staff. And so this is completely overshadowed, certainly in the short term, all of the good work that business has apparently been doing from a CSR and environmental perspective. So my question in relation to that is just how fragile is consumer confidence and belief in the ethical practice of the businesses they buy from? Sarah, again, I'll come to you first, if I may, in relation to that.
Yeah, and I know I sound a bit like a broken record, but I mean, you have got to know about your material issues. But also appreciate that there are certain behaviours that you have to do anyway. There are certain non-negotiables of being a business operating in 2021, and you can't move away from that. And so you have to sort of look at your whole business and understand where we're doing a great job. So we're very happy talking about our commitments to recycled PET. And, I think I mentioned it before, our halos, but also our shadows, because when we're talking about these things, you have to be prepared for that added scrutiny. And exactly as we have seen in the last 10 days, is that, yeah, you talk about doing a great thing, you talk about being your ambition to be net zero, but actually the way you treat your employees or the culture within the business is pretty toxic, and you can't have one without the other. And I think this is something you can't. ESG isn't just a shopping list. There are certain things that there's a foundation level that you have to get right. Those are non-negotiable. And I think you have to, and this is very difficult for business leaders to understand, because they like to be able to sit in a meeting room and have lots of decisions facing them, particularly when it comes to where they're going to invest. And we were talking about planning and budgeting to start off with. But there are some things, such as decarbonisation, such as treating your employees and the people in your supply chain with respect, and respecting their well-being, that you have just got to do anyway. And I think that's something that some businesses are going to sort of learn the hard way, as it were. But again, I think you've got to believe in people's positive intent to bring it to life. And I think consumers are prepared to give many companies the benefit of the doubt, as we have seen. And it was very similar with a coffee company and tax a few years ago. Everyone boycotted them for 2 weeks, and a month later, sales were completely back to normal. I think now you might see it might take a little bit longer, but then again, it depends on the circumstance, and it depends how the company responds to it. I think what you have to do is make sure that you're honest, open, transparent, and respond to it in a timely way. Because I think, and I'll defer to Rachel on this, but I think the way in which you respond to some of those criticisms will depend how long you're living in the shadow of those criticisms.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the issues that is really key was something that actually you said right at the beginning, Sarah, where you talked about the tone of a company and you talked about humility. And I think one of the things we've seen in the last 10 days or so is where a value that has been talked about externally has not been reflected internally, and definitely isn't supported, obviously, by or endorsed by those people who've lived and worked in the company. So I think your point around the tone in your communications is really important, I think, in this context. And I also think, again, the role of leaders in communicating a business, what it stands for and what it is about, is really important. We know that people want to know who sits behind the business, how it's run, and that is part, exactly as you said, of how people are making their choices and decisions to have different views, as it were. So I think, you know, I don't think there's probably anything else to add on that there. I think the only other thing I would say is you have to be able to have integrity across all of the different ways in which you communicate, and you can't. One of the things I think is interesting about what we're talking about is you can't really do anything just to communicate it. This is about actually doing something that is the right thing as a business, and then communications is part of that. But if we're doing something just for the social media response or for the positive column inches in a newspaper, then I think that's where we all become a little unstuck.
Thank you both. Sarah, one of the points you mentioned in your response there was how short-lived the impact can sometimes be, and that was one of the questions, one of the issues that I did want to address, which is, you know, just how short a memory and how fickle is social media. Does popular opinion and do reputational fortunes change with the wind, and how enduring an impact can a Twitter storm or any other social media storm have on a business? Rachel, can I come to you first in that context? What is the longevity of the impact of social media fallout when it comes to any particular issue?
It's an interesting question. I actually think it's less about the platform and it's more about the issue, to be fair, because different platforms are designed for different forms of communication. You know, things move very, very quickly on Twitter, and so conversations on one day can trend and they can be gone the next. Sometimes content, visual content, memes, film can live a little bit longer on some of the other platforms such as Facebook or Instagram. But fundamentally, I still think it goes back to the issue itself. A kind of a public spat on social media, yes, might disappear a little bit quicker than perhaps an open letter to employees, or might go a little bit quicker than some fundamental human rights issues that, you know, we've seen, or horrendous supply chain grievances that a number of companies have faced. Those issues, whether they play out in social media or around the dining room table conversation, or whether they are in the, you know, traditional media, it's the issue, I think, that determines how long something circulates for, in my opinion.
Thank you, sir. I mean, I guess when it comes to businesses strategizing for and preparing to respond to social media storms, you know, every news story has its own particular context. So is there a single best kind of policy or approach which a business can take when it comes to addressing, you know, a public response to sort of reputation busting news stories, or is it simply a case of reacting as best you can with the right team around you when the fallout happens? Rachel, I guess that this is firmly up your street.
Thank you. Well, I think there are a set of principles that businesses follow in these sorts of any form of crisis, again, whether it's a social media storm or whether it's an operational issue that a business might face. I think, yes, it's really important to act quickly. It's really important to reach out to those individuals who have been impacted. There's a tonal response to be considered about the seriousness in which you are addressing the said issue. There's questions around which type of messenger do you use to communicate. So I mentioned earlier we do a lot of work with behavioural science experts, and you might be aware of a book called Messengers by Steve Martin, who looks at whether you use soft or hard messages when delivering different forms of communication, and how different leaders embody different sorts of messages in the way that they communicate. And so I think there are questions to be seen around that. There are some issues where the CEO needs to address in response, and there are others actually where a technical, to Sarah's point earlier about an expert, if there's a sustainability issue at Britvic, I would imagine Sarah speaking about that with the depth of knowledge that she has is as important as somebody else from the leadership team. So I think those sorts of questions are the things that one ask. I think, but one of the most important things that businesses need to remember is not to communicate until you've really worked out what it is that you're communicating about, because that's unfortunately what gives oxygen to the story. So you'll have seen so many instances where businesses have definitely reacted quickly. They've been very assertive, only to discover some of the statements they are making are not actually, they didn't actually know were true at the time. And so then that's how the story moves on. So I think there are just some principles that businesses just need to be cognizant of when they're facing some of this scrutiny.
Thank you both. I'm conscious that we've got a second topic that we have trailed in our kind of marketing for this event, and we should really move on and address it, which is the issue of trial by social media. And actually a lot of what you've just been saying, Rachel, is directly relevant to this issue. So I'll set the context briefly. For many years we've seen legal disputes basically being fought behind metaphorically closed doors. Businesses haven't liked washing their dirty linen in public. The only really high profile disputes we've seen have typically involved celebrities or politicians. Now the rise of clickbait reporting and social media has turned that on its head in recent years. More and more disputes which would never previously have commanded public attention do now find themselves played out by the protagonists on social media before audiences of millions of people who have a platform to comment in whatever manner they see fit. We quite often see this sort of dispute play out when it comes to branding disputes. So with mainstream media fueling the debate, and then sort of Twitter users, social media users, not being at all shy when it comes to having their say. So I'm thinking, for example, Marks and Spencer's and Aldi and their spat about Caterpillar cakes. I'm thinking about Brewdog facing a backlash a couple of years ago for going in with some guns blazing when a bar in Birmingham opened up using the brand that Brewdog uses for its spirits. So consumer brand owners are now very well aware that branding disputes can play out on social media, and some deliberately court social media attention in an effort to garner popular support for their position in those disputes. So my questions: when brand owners do decide to fire off a cease and desist letter for where their competitors launch a challenger product which they know is going to attract fire for looking and feeling a bit too much like the market leading product, are those businesses proactively strategizing about the potential mainstream and social media fallout, or are they typically just scrambling to react when that fallout starts? And I'll come to Rachel first on that, please, and then Sarah afterwards. But Rachel, your views on that, please.
Yeah, I think it's very hard to make a statement about how businesses are organised and structured in order, sort of behind the scenes, for them to decide how to face the fallout. So I think some organisations are incredibly sophisticated, and that the legal teams will be engaged with the communications, sustainability, brand, and there are other organisations whereby that communication, that connection doesn't happen. I think, again, we've made these points, I think, earlier on, but I think anything that is happening shouldn't be done just for the fallout that might, or the criticism that might come from mainstream or social media. I think we've got the acceptance that we all operate within this sort of broader court of public opinion, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we should be fearful of the scrutiny when we want to make good operational, commercial and good decisions. That still sits at the heart, I think, of good, corporate governance and good business. So I think that's, I think that's my first point on that. So the public opinion is important, but you shouldn't be driven by just the reputation. You should be driven by the right decision. And it's interesting now, I think I mentioned at the beginning, I mentioned the concept of kind of conversations around the family table. And I think what we have seen in recent years is that boardroom conversations are now played out in social media, but they're played out in the pub, they're played out around the family dinner table, because the concept of good corporate governance and how businesses behave is a broad mainstream discussion, I think, now. I think in terms of your point around whether or not to get involved in spats, I think that's the next level down around the tone of your brand. I mean, some brands can get away with a little bit of humour on social. I think some brands are fantastic at just engaging and not taking themselves too seriously, but that does depend on your overall brand. I think one of the things I mentioned from the networked age at the beginning, one of the rules that we have, or a piece of advice essentially we have for clients when discussing this, is we talk about the rules of influence when it's played out in social. So the first is around who you are is important as what you do. The second is passions and influences spread ideas. And then the third in this context is really important, I think. So arguments are never won, outcomes are. The concept of IP and whether or not somebody should take on another brand, that you will be an argument that you will not always be able to win, but the output, which might be consumers understanding the important investment in innovation, in new product lines, which is connected to IP, and a consumer understanding why that is important. It would have been interesting to know, I was thinking, if M&S had led a content campaign that showed what would have happened had they not had the opportunity to invest innovation in so many of their product lines and protect the quality service that they provide for consumers. So I think it does depend on the brand and the context, and again, as we said at the beginning, the issue that you're discussing when it comes to engaging on social media.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. I mean, it certainly is the case that the context does kind of confine or lead how a business might respond. So your point about, maybe M&S might have had an opportunity to explain about the relevance and investment in IP and its importance. In the context of Caterpillar case, it's really difficult for a business to do that, because most of the content and the the social media comment in relation to that issue, we're kind of looking at it in a pretty trivial way, thinking that these are just cakes, does it really matter? It is really difficult then to start to get all serious, and any attempts to do that have their own impact on the way the brand is perceived by the consumer base. So it's really difficult to call it right. So Sarah, I know this isn't your area particularly, but I was just wondering if you had any views in relation to that, or whether you'd endorse what Rachel has said.
I completely agree with what Rachel said, and particularly, you have to look at all brands and businesses have to, they will have crisis management processes, not purely for social media, but for all different communication platforms and all different stakeholder groups. But this is where, there are particular brands out there that actively go out to court controversy, and that is the nature of their brand. That necessarily wouldn't apply to Robinsons, because it's a family favourite brand. They're not out there to court controversy. If you look at one of our other brands such as Tango is a bit more edgy, and so it'll have a very, very different tone of voice, and it'll stand for different things. So it'll be prepared to go out and make statements on different things, which is very different to Robinsons. So I think it's really important to understand your brand personality, and understand that tone that we have been talking about, and where does it fit. And it comes back to one of my earlier points. Brands and companies need to know what they stand for. You can't stand for everything, and that has got to come through in your communications, regardless of format.
Okay, thank you. No, that's raised a question in my mind, which probably is one for Rachel as well, which is that brand owners obviously need to be careful before they get drawn into a social media spat. What I was going to ask is, can brands afford not to get drawn in? Can they afford to stay silent and let their competitor do whatever they want to do? I think probably what I'm hearing from Sarah is it depends on the brand, and that the consumers will expect certain behaviour from certain brands and certain different behaviour from certain others, and what might be okay for one might not be okay for another. Is that your take on things, or am I wildly offbeat?
No, I don't think you're wildly offbeat. I don't think it's almost as simple, though, as it's not quite as simple, I think, as a binary sort of discussion. Is it silence or is it engagement? I think we are working in a digital environment now where there are so many different platforms. You have your own owned channels as an organization. You will have your own website, your own channels that you can communicate. You've got, you know, traditional media, you've got social media, and I think it's not necessarily as do you communicate, don't you communicate? I think it's about how you communicate. I think in many instances silence isn't really an option. That doesn't mean that you suddenly got to start responding to every tweet that's ever written about you in any context. And I think the ability to monitor your social channels in an effective manner and be prepared is one of those key points. I think to Sarah's point, she's absolutely right. When you talk about the different brands, we've got a model called the Purpose Pathfinder, and we talk about 3 different ways in which brands can helpfully communicate their purpose dependent on the brand. One is around change, and so those brands who are a little bit more activist, a little bit more edgy, as Sarah was describing earlier, they can communicate change narratives where they sort of fight injustice, they take stands on issues, they make a very polarized view on and they encourage sort of polarization almost because they stand for something. And I think you can look at change narratives there. I think other brands are more community focused. They talk about taking care of people and the world. They talk about things that are happening within their sphere of influence. And then the third category we talk about is utility. And those are the brands when they stand for something, but it's almost about the quality of the product. They sort of sidestep social issues and they focus on the individual flourishing, individual contributions. And so I think they're slightly separate, the questions of silence versus engagement. The question is then how, and then I think that's where you decide how you communicate based on your brand.
The next question that follows on, and you've already kind of answered a lot of it and addressed it in a number of respects in the answer you've just given, is, you know, we've talked about brands which do deliberately court controversy and court public opinion. I was going to ask whether that's a good idea or whether it's just inherently too risky to be worth doing. I think what I'm hearing from you is that it probably depends on the brand, what the brand stands for, what the target market for the particular brand is. Some brands can get away with it, some brands might not be able to, some brands might put content out there or comment out there which will provoke a storm and be able to ride that storm, whereas others won't and will suffer more long-lasting damage as a result. Is that a fair reflection of the answer that you gave to the previous question, Rachel?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's dependent on the tone of your brand. As Sarah said, it's what you stand for as a business. And then I think the third layer is actually, what does your target audience believe? How do they feel? And then how do you engage with them, I think is the next layer there.
Great, thank you very much. Look, I'm conscious that what I don't want to happen is my poor connection making the end of this session completely fragmented. I think we've covered an awful lot of ground. Rachel and Sarah, thank you very much for your insights. Hopefully you've given everybody who's joined us today plenty to ponder. You know, I guess if I take anything away from today's session, from a CSR perspective, it's that, you know, businesses shouldn't be shy or reticent about admitting that, you know, there are commercial motivations for their CSR policies, as well as motivated to implement those policies because it's the right thing to do, and businesses shouldn't be shy about acknowledging that, and that while cynicism does exist within the consumer base about the credentials of a business's CSR policies, the best way to address that is by being specific about what you're doing and keeping it as simple as possible. And I guess from the on the second issue, my main takeaways in relation to fighting out branding disputes on social media, it's, you know, understand what your brand stands for, understand who your demographic is, and tailor your strategy accordingly, because what works for one won't necessarily work for the other. But yeah, thank you again very much, Sarah and Rachel, for your insights today. It's been really great to hear from you. To everybody else who's been joining us today, I hope you have found today's session interesting, insightful, and of some value. If you do have any questions about any of the issues you've heard about today, please do get in touch with us, leave your details, and we'll get back to you. And finally, please do try to find some time to feedback about today's event about, the issues you've heard about, the format. You know, it's invaluable to us in making sure we put together events in the future which are valuable to people. So that's it from us for now. Thank you and goodbye.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.